Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today on the next installment in the CTA webinar series. I'm very excited to be joined by my friends, Matt, David, Samantha, and Derek this morning. I'm going to let each one of them go around and introduce themselves. But my name is Michael Daniel. I'm the president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance. And I'm very much looking forward to talking about this issue of systemic risk and how we can really address it. So let me go around and let each of the participants just introduce themselves briefly. So Matt, why don't we start with you?
My name's Matt Olney. I'm the Director of Threat Intelligence and Interdiction at Cisco Systems.
Dave?
Hi, Dave Beabout, Chief Information Security Officer for NTT Security Holdings and the International Leader for Public-Private Partnerships.
Great. Samantha?
Samantha Madrid, CTA board member and longtime cybersecurity executive.
Derek?
Derek Manky, Chief Security Strategist and Global VP Threat Intelligence at Fortinet, and also head our global public and private partnerships.
Great. Well, thanks all of you for joining me this morning to talk about some of the issues of systemic risk in cybersecurity. As we all know, there are a lot of benefits to being part of the connected world. That's why, people connect, is because there's a lot of benefits from joining that digital ecosystem, but it also comes with some risk. And I think in particular, in a networked environment, it turns out that some risk is actually shared between participants in the network. And so the first question I want to sort of raise is sort of why is this the case? And what are some of the examples that of how this plays out in our digital ecosystem? Matt, I don't know, maybe I'll start with you to start on that question.
I mean, it's pretty self-evident. Like you're essentially operating in what the military considers a battle space. So you are together in this virtual environment. There is a social aspect to it. You are dependent on the goodwill of others for things to connect and operate correctly. And you're at risk for malicious actors. And your risk, because we are increasingly complex and interconnected, events in another part of the network can impact you because you are dependent on the availability or the integrity of that part of the network. So the connectiveness means we are connecting the benefits, but we're also connecting the risks of the environment.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And like, even if you try to take steps to address your risk and reduce your risk, other people's actions still affect you when you're part of a shared network, and that's sort of inescapable. But I don't know. I mean, Derek, do you have some examples that you like to use about how this works?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I agree with what Matt said. Obviously, it is self-evident, and we the more interconnectivity we have, the more complexity there is. That attack surface is bigger. In reality, too, unfortunately, Michael, we still live in a world of, and this is on the shared participant angle. We still live in a world of unsegmented networks, flat networks in a lot of cases, which absolutely shouldn't be the case, and that opens up a lot of issues, obviously, when it comes to more interconnectivity on people, process technologies, things like authentication that should be happening. We're moving, when we look at the NOC and the SOC and the OT/IT environments, that's a classic example as well too, right? Where you have shared access now and it's becoming more and more complex. And I mean, the air gap has been effectively declared dead, right? So again, the more you share between those networks, the more access there are, the more APIs there are, the more misconfigurations there are, the more human errors there are, and then the more likelihood also for a malicious intent and insider threat can occur as well too, especially when we see these examples of remote hiring into networks too.
Yeah. Samantha, Dave, either one of you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, actually, I want to just zero in a little bit more on what Derek and Matt were talking about, specifically around the processes and the technology. We've heard the standard people processing technology kind of being the foundation to how we think about planning and investing and kind of what our potential risks are moving forward. But, kind of really what Derek zeroed in on, a lot of networks are dated. My words, not his. They're flat. The investment varies from network to network. And there's a lot of reasons behind it we can dive into. But I really think the up-leveling of technology, even what we have today, not even considering what's coming in the future, is paramount to kind of mitigating and limiting as much as possible the exposure to any type of targeted or more widespread attack.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll jump in there as well. I agree with everything that's been said, and I would also, a little bit of a different lens is to say from a supply chain perspective, our systems are so interconnected, and the services that we're on are, there's upstream effects that can affect the masses downstream. So that's a, pretty simple perspective. But that's not just on the digital side. There is a physical supply chain to the components that make up the other person's computer that is the cloud that we have to be concerned about that supports that entire infrastructure. So it's not just digital, that it transfers into that physical world and all the supporting pieces that a small thing upstream can affect a large mass of people downstream.
Yeah.
Great point.
And I also, I think that what this sort of does though is, if I put on an economic lens and use that kind of analysis, then what you would say is that some of this risk that is shared, right, between people, makes it a public risk in effect, like a public good, only in this case it's a public risk, as opposed to a purely private risk or a private good, right? So there's some element of being part of the digital ecosystem that is there's a public risk there. And what are some of the implications if, some of the cyber risk is not entirely private, if some of it is in effect a public good, or in this case, a public bad, I think that actually has some implications for how we think about managing the cybersecurity risk, because it's not purely like your decision to accept risk actually, for example, is forcing everybody else in the ecosystem to also accept that risk, even though they don't get a say in that necessarily. And so what are some of the other implications from, that cyber risk being partially public and partially private? Derek, maybe I'll start with you on that one.
Sure. Yeah. So obviously when we start talking about, when I hear the words public risk, private risk, my mind immediately goes to examples of public cloud, private cloud, hybrid cloud, and all the risks that are associated with that. David was just talking about upstream risk and supply chain, and essentially it's the same thing. It's where's your data? Where's your intellectual property? Your applications, where are they living? On a public risk environment, whose cybersecurity controls are they? Do you know? Have they been certified? All of those questions need to come into play because that is a shared public risk environment. That's a public attack surface. Again, it's connected to directly to the adversary because that is a public environment that comes with a big risk. When we look at hybrid environments, hybrid cloud and private cloud environments, again, that is something directly in control of the organization, but it also falls into all those shared risk things that we just talked about as well, too, with the interconnectivity and so forth. And then you throw in what David was just talking about with supply chain, open source as well. So software libraries, components in there that are coming from those public, environments that are now put into living in your value chain as well too. The same questions have to be applied to. So, my perspective, it's once you go into a hybrid environment, the risk is actually can be greater because you have more components that you have to manage, but also it can come with some values too.
Yeah. No. Samantha, thoughts on this particular aspect?
That's I agree with Derek. When I think of public and private, I think those distinctions are going away. I think things are blurring and they're coming together. And really goes to what Derek was saying, the data. Where does the data lie? And anytime you are engaging with the quote public, meaning a partner upstream supply chain, that we talked about earlier, you start to extend the overall attack surface where how you're targeted and who's being targeted and the implication of that continues to broaden its exposure. Put it more simply, you're really talking about broad exposure, fast replication versus targeted attacks designed for a particular environment. As those environments become more commingled, they're shared, that's just, it kind of broadens everything, and it really impacts the economic exposure, not just the technology and the exposure to the products itself.
Yeah, I think that's right. Although I would also say that, at least again, when I sort of put on my economic hat, right, and you think about like how a company chooses to address, or an organization chooses to address its risk, right? They can mitigate some of it, they can they can transfer it through insurance, and some of it they can just accept. But what it may be the case is that if some of that risk is public and they don't fully feel it, they may accept more risk than actually the system as a whole would want that particular entity to accept. And I think
Totally.
just like the private sector will tend to underinvest in public goods because the benefit comes back to everybody, not just the individual.
Mhm.
The you may have underinvestment in cybersecurity as a result of some of this risk being public. And Dave, I don't know if that's something that you've seen sort of from that, from a telco perspective.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. And what comes up for me as we talk about this topic is it makes me think, is there really anything that is really a private risk today? I
Exactly.
don't know. Well, let's just assume that there is. In my mind, how would I define that? That would be something that would be totally contained within my organization's control and does not affect those who the organization serves in-house. That's very rare. But that would be a consideration for something that's private. But what it also makes me think of is, from an international perspective, there are regulatory requirements where you have to disclose, depending
Right.
on the data that is inherent, whether or not it's public or private risk, the data that's involved. Now we're forced into a public situation, and the penalties that come with that. GDPR is an example of that, e-privacy. Not calling them out as negative, just to say that
Right.
that's an example of something that makes me think, public versus private. I might want to keep it private, to your point about, that benefits me as an organization and I can handle it internally because it's in my control. But if I'm forced because of where I operate to make it public, whole other conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Matt, any thoughts on
Like my notes literally is there's almost zero pure private risk. Like I'm completely with David. Um, like if the private risk is enough to substantially impact an organization, then it becomes a public risk. And then if it's a private risk that affects the organization but doesn't affect outside, then it's no longer our problem. Like that's it's purely an organizational side stuff. So yeah, the idea of, and you have to approach that as a consumer as well as someone who's running an operation. As a consumer, you have to understand that everything you put in then puts you at risk because your data is in that environment, or you are reliant on that service, or you are in need of that contact. And when those things go away, they affect huge swaths of people potentially. And so when we're approaching supporting each other as we're looking at doing, we have to understand that that support conveys through to society. Like this is not an operation just to take care of ourselves, but by taking care of ourselves and take care of each other, we are taking care of everyone who is on the internet.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that's right. The Let me switch gears a little bit and kind of come at this from another direction. We also know that engagement with and reliance upon the digital environment is not the same across all organizations. And we also know all of you have lived this, that the technical capabilities, the process capabilities are not the same in every organization. They vary wildly, right? So how does this sort of unevenness in capability, digital engagement, how does that affect the distribution of cyber risk, at least in your mind? So I don't know if anybody, Dave, you want to take the lead on this one?
Yeah, sure. So it makes me think, the unevenness makes me think of the, weakest link in the chain and the consideration of that. So when I look at that from an internal security perspective, I have to be looking up and down where I have those dependencies, and I need to know, and really it's a requirement that we make sure that we actually do the diligence in making sure that we have managed the risk to the point that we can, and that we're aware of where those potential situations take place and that we guard or manage against it. That's our responsibility as a service provider, but it's also our responsibility just as good security professionals. So there's that weak link sort of perspective. We have to think about that because it is uneven. And that gets back to, again, the larger piece of managing risk. And we talked about it already. I'll use the word supply chain again, but it's all the way up and down. I think is where I would just leave that to begin with.
I I would also add to that, Michael, that yeah, so I agree with the weak link in the chain, but more links in the chain as well too, right? You have more organizations, you have that unevenness. When I think that word unevenness, I also think silos, because that happens a lot in organizations where you have different groups thinking they're doing the right thing, not talking to each other. Classic example is what I was talking about before with the knock and the sock. And and then you have a lot of, in our industry, a lot of M&A acquisitions, subsidiaries coming in, all running in their own controls. And how do you manage the risk across all of that? Because you do have this shared ecosystem now. So a lot of that does come down to policy as well, too, making sure that it overarcs all of those organizations. Because, yeah, in reality, you do have these silos with different databases and stores and applications and different security controls around those too.
The one of the things that you mentioned, Michael, that kind of caught my ear was like capabilities. And you and I have sat in a lot of meetings with various groups talking about how do we share more information? How do we get more data between things? And we hardly ever, not never, but hardly ever talk about sharing capabilities. Like, because of the way our supply chain is constructed, there are actually corporations in the world that have come together to build organizations to supply capabilities to their supply chain. That's how important the supply chain piece is as you go up kind of the size of the corporations. And if we can find more ways to share the capabilities, not just the information about the actors, I think we're going to be in a much better place.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And, because those capabilities are so unevenly distributed, right? You've got large companies that have extensive cybersecurity capabilities, all the way down to very small organizations who barely are able to, protect their individual laptops that they use to do, their work. What I also think about is, in some ways I end up thinking about risk as almost like water, right? And it tends to flow through the ecosystem, and it ends up pooling in different places, in ways that we might not really sort of fully appreciate. And again, I'll extend the metaphor, and it's kind of like, how deep is that pool, right? Like, and if I step in it, what's going to actually happen? Is it only this deep, or am I gonna, go up to my knees, or, so I mean, Samantha, I don't know if you had some thoughts on that as well.
I was thinking as my panelists were here giving their perspectives, which I agree with everything that they said. I was also wanted to take it back to something extremely basic. I think it goes back to people, processes, and technology, which is the reason for the unevenness, or the unevenness is the result of those three things. It's been longstanding by most cybersecurity professionals that people are the weakest link. They're well-meaning, they're trying to do the right thing, they're trying to do what's the right thing for their jobs, for their organization. And so that has an inherent risk. I believe that's going to remain true for quite some time. But I do believe the growing risk is around the technology and the fact that a lot of these companies aren't investing to the degree in which their customers think they are in terms of the technology. So when you have engagements with your partners or you have your customers, or they're thinking they're engaging in an environment or with a service that is fully protected and safeguarding their data, but that's not entirely the truth, right? And so I think there needs to be some financial incentive for organizations to upgrade their networks, to upgrade their technologies. And I don't know what that looks like. I'm throwing something out there. I'd love to hear people's perspectives on this. But there needs to be an event that is financially motivated, not just from the threat actors trying to infiltrate your network, but for those responsible for building and maintaining the networks, where they see an upside. Right now, for them, it used to be, oh, keep yourselves off the front of the a global newspaper. No one cares about that, truly. Yes, if you ask a board member, do they want to have their company or their executives on the nightly news? No, they don't. But it's clearly not a big enough event or risk for them to make the investments. I've been in countless, I'm sure all of you have as well, meetings with Fortune 500 companies and government entities that have very dated technology, very dated. It would blow people's minds how dated it is. So I think there needs to be a financial incentive, just to close, that makes it so these folks responsible for building these networks and are supported in doing so. Because it's not just the security professionals saying, hey, which they are, you need to upgrade your network. It's those that are, have on the, it's the executives in the organization, it's the board members, the shareholders. They need to have accountability there to some degree.
Yeah, and I think that actually leads me right. So thank you. That leads me right into kind of where I wanted to take the discussion, Samantha, because I think this. So there's a lot of science out there that shows that humans are actually pretty bad at estimating certain kinds of risk. And I think what you were just saying is like the companies like sort of woefully underestimate the risk of an event, for example. And if you sort of purely define your role, like in doing cybersecurity, as like keeping the organization off the front page and the CEO out of jail, that's probably not a sufficient sort of analysis of the role. And then you sort of layer in the unevenness of being able to even respond to that and do something to manage your risk. We end up in this like. It contributes to this really complicated cybersecurity environment that we have. And I think this is the thread that I wanted to pull on here, is that the result of that is that's what I think my personal belief is this is one of the reasons why cybersecurity is such a hard problem, and why it's not purely a technical problem that is actually easy to solve. And so that's kind of what the next sort of question I wanted us to explore is, and maybe Samantha will come right back to you and sort of say, does what I'm saying make sense? Does that sort of logically flow from what you were laying out?
Absolutely. I think we have a lot of smart people, not just on this call, but in our industry, right? And really technically smart people. If you gave them a technical problem, they will come back to you with tremendous ways of how to solve it. But the people piece, right? We've always looked at the people piece as being the weak link, and it is from a user perspective. But the people are also deciding the policies. They're making the technology investments. And so you have these situations that are creating things that go beyond the classic, how do I solve this technical problem, as you said, and how do you do that? And that's why I was saying earlier, we don't have to rehash it, but there needs to be more than just a risk of jail or a risk of finding yourselves in nightly news to kind of push the people into the direction of making it so, there's less of an impact. And I'm hoping we're going to get to the systemic aspect of this.
Yep.
Because I think that is where, coupled with technology is very important, but I think that's where folks will really get caught on their back foot when something happens because of the data technology they have in their networks today.
Yeah.
I mean, there is no complexity without risk. Like, complexity drives risk. There is no way to do something complex without risk. And then the reason security is so hard is the business revenue generating side of the world is like, I can do more and more complex things that makes me more and more money and generates more and more services and products and whatever else. And the overall state of the world goes up. But the best way to make something more secure is to reduce the risk, or sorry, to reduce the complexity. And there's just no space in the world today for that. And so you look at something like AI coming out, where there are millions more AI experts claim than there are actual people who understand the AI space. And
Yes.
you're trying to make correct decisions at the corporate level on how to use this new technology. And like the risks just aren't fully apparent at this point, because that is an incredibly complex piece of machinery, no matter which aspect of AI you're looking at. And asking, a company who specializes in, precision steel milling to make those kind of decisions is insane from a systemic piece. So the systemic piece, to Samantha's kind of desire to get to that, really is, we are out accelerating our ability to understand the thing that we're building. And if you don't understand the thing that you're building, you can't secure it. And we are very much at that point right now.
Yeah, and I would. No, go ahead.
Go ahead, Michael.
Well, what I was going to say, Derek, was that, I mean, even like Matt's absolutely right. We don't fully understand things, and we don't fully understand sometimes what has been taken on. So I'll take the Change Healthcare incident for this past spring. I don't think anybody, I certainly didn't know, understood that one company processed the data for 1/3 of the American population. So 1/3 of the American population's healthcare data was reliant on this one company. And I don't think most people sort of appreciated that. And I don't think even most people in the medical field even really understood exactly how big that organization had become, or how important it was to the entire healthcare system. And so this gets at the point about systemic risk. And Matt, your point about the complexity, like, we've put all these pieces together and haven't really realized what we've actually done, right? And this is what I mean by, like, we've got these pools of risk now that have ended up, the pool has gotten very large, and we haven't even really been tracking how large that pool is. And I think that has a lot of profound implications for how we think about, so complexity and systemic risk, really make our job as cybersecurity practitioners way harder than, perhaps it's never been easy, right? But it's now getting progressively harder to be a practitioner in this space and actually have some success. But Derek, let me head over to you.
Yeah, and I think the reason that this is so hard, and this is going again into that systemic issue, is I think we have this nasty triangle of dependency that's happening. And what I mean by that is, you're going back to the people, process, technology. If you look at that in a triangle, you have the classic skills gap. So capability, and capacity, that's classic skills gap issue that we've been talking about for 10 years. Not enough people, not enough good people. Yeah, there are good people in the industry, but now that everybody's affected by cybersecurity, and that we have this ever opening attack surface with operational technology. Now you look at CVEs, we're hitting record amounts every year. It's like we're already over 29,000 this year. It's like, where does it stop, right? So that's always going to be an issue. But then without the people, as Matt said, now you have organizations that are essentially forced to rely to depend on technology. So AI, right? Thinking this is the answer. When in fact, necessarily isn't necessarily the answer. And so as a result, you have these organizations that are now depending on these data hungry models on anything that they can find. Um, and that's where that goes to the public risk that we are talking about earlier, that shared risk and all those sort of questions I asked before. So it is a um, definitely a complexity issue. I don't think we're going to get away from that, and those complexity points obviously become targets for attackers. We talk about that all the time, right? When it's on shared public risk, looking at reconnaissance, initial access tactics, and all of that. And then I also think I talk about this analogy a lot before on the systemic issue. We also have this inherent people problem internally. I call it the primal instinct, right? So as humans, we have a primal instinct to understand risk and fear in the physical domain, not so much in the cyber domain. And again, that comes down to that skills gap in training and this also overconfidence that we have in security. I see
Yeah.
that out there a lot. We actually did a survey to over 500 C-suite executives on cybersecurity implementations, and when it boiled down to it, our figure was that about over 70% of the respondents were just too overconfident too.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really interesting finding, but I mean, it certainly tracks.
I would never
Yeah.
trust. I would never trust a confident security practitioner. Like that's just
Yeah,
every good practitioner I know is like, I'm not sure. We got to figure this out.
exactly. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Yeah, so
Yeah, no,
I think, let's go ahead, Michael.
no, go ahead, David.
I was just looking at this from a little bit of a different perspective too. I wholeheartedly agree with what everybody has said so far, but I will throw this perspective in there too, where we've seen with the current guidance that's come out of CISA, for example, right? We've seen this shift to secure by design, which companies are disincentivized to do, right? Spend as little as possible to be profitable for the shareholders and all the things, to secure by demand. So the consumers, the members of the supply chain that are looking to work with one another and each other, they're going to start demanding higher levels of things. So this is an interesting shift where even from a policy standpoint, we're looking to mitigate some of that unevenness by educating people. So, people process
Yeah.
technology, but educating them, even people who are not, fabricators who are not in that game at all and don't really want to have to deal with it, least they can get smarter about what they're looking for and ensuring that there's a better distribution of the risk or that they're smarter in what they're getting into. So it's somewhat of a recent interesting development, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. So, I mean, I think, what I wanted to turn the conversation to is then, so if we've got these elements of public risk, if we've got these elements of systemic risk and this unevenness, sort of what is the role of the cybersecurity industry then? What is the role of cybersecurity providers like all of us are to help manage the systemic risk? Like, what's the role of the industry in this? And I think sort of, by extension, then, what's the role of government, right? So how should we be thinking about that distribution of responsibility between cybersecurity providers and the government in this space? Because in a lot of other sort of areas of society, we've actually assigned most of that responsibility to governments, but governments don't really have the resources or the capability in the digital ecosystem that they do in the physical world in many instances. So that leads me down a slightly different path, but that's kind of what I want to explore in kind of the last part of this webinar is what roles do cybersecurity providers play, and how should we think about that versus the government?
Well, the way we're thinking about it in terms of like product development and stuff as a cybersecurity provider is we want to make it safe for customers to fail. Right. We want to make it so, yeah, your cybersecurity training failed and that person clicked that link that led to that malicious thing, but you were contained in a browser that had these controls, etc. We have to understand not the not the optimal end state, but the fact that there will be deficiencies and make it so when those deficiencies come up, the least problematic outcome of that is what happens. You're looking to like minimize impact just because, again, of the complexity and all the different ways that actors can get in and stolen credentials, or zero-day exploits or exploits of unpatched vulnerabilities. All of those failure points, you need to start making the depth of your defenses greater so that you're not so dependent on those security best practices. You still have to like go after them for an optimal outcome, but like when you miss that mark, and we know that companies will always miss the mark because they're humans, there is a back channel of product and capability and services and personnel that fill that gap when needed.
Yeah, no, I like that idea of also sort of, assuming that there'll be some process failures, though, assuming that there'll be that, I feel like a lot of times we sort of assume perfection, rather than sort of assume, that there'll be some deficiencies in there and build that into the system. I think the other thing that I think about is where our IT systems are very brittle. They're not very good at sort of graceful degradation, right? And it's actually something that you see a lot more of in like, redundant engineering and safety and things like automobiles and stuff like that. Just because one component of the car like has problems does not mean the whole car like crashes. There's some graceful degradation to the capabilities. But Derek, other thoughts on like sort of what role the cybersecurity industry and cybersecurity providers should play in helping to manage this systemic risk?
So I think it's shared again. Obviously, when you think of cybersecurity providers, you think of resilient systems mitigations, but nothing is a silver bullet. As Matt was just saying, what you were saying with your car analogy, there's always going to be a failure point, and so I think obviously there's a core component for cybersecurity companies, as is the model, right, to manage risk, to help mitigate, to fill skills gaps through training and education and services, managed services as well, to relieve the burden on the customer, going back to that triangle of dependency that I was talking about as well. But then I also think that, again, this goes back to what we advocate for all the time, the public and private partnerships. I think that is also a key part of it. As you said, Michael, we used to push this all back on the government, but in reality, the government um, sort of has been led blind in some cases, right? So I think, again, this is really where the public and private partnerships have to come in to manage that systemic risk, on doing joint campaigns, on advisories, on education, as I said before, too, obviously the threat intelligence and sharing information and so forth, too. Um, because again, the cybersecurity companies are not the only answer. They're part of that ecosystem. And
Right.
the only way to holistically manage that systemic risk through the ecosystem is to have those connection points, through workshops and all the good things that we do, even up to the highest level where you look at events like NATO lock shields that happened, where you do full breach and attack simulations, and you bring all those different components in, as part of that shared systemic risk. I think those live fire exercises really help as well too.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Dave?
Yeah, completely agree. I think and as I think about the public-private partnership piece too, I think we're doing a lot better as an ecosystem and we're evolving that. I think things are improving. But one of the reasons why that is so powerful is because there's already networked connections amongst the providers, like much like
Mm,
what we do, in order to share information. But I think the key word in that is speed. If we waited on governments between countries to allow all of this and to take the lead, everything would be irrelevant by the time that the channels were open, right? So I think we're seeing a lot more of that company to company connection, which I think is extremely important because it's about speed. And that incentivizes the organizations as well to be able to respond. Something Matt, you said was about the customer experience piece and security people showing up and thinking differently about potential faults in what's going on. And there's an actual economic incentive to having a service that people want to consume and that they're easy to do business with because you expected that this might take place and you thought ahead. The last thing I'll say here is I think R&D is something service providers actually have an important part that they need to provide. We have the budgets, we have the time, we have the interest in putting those things together to learn, but it's also in public interest in the betterment of everyone else, society in general, that we make sure that we're making some of that available where it's possible, so that we're staying ahead of the game, at least looking over the horizon rather than right here, right now with this cool feature. Let's pick our head up and look forward a little bit.
No, yeah, that makes sense. Samantha, any thoughts on this one?
Well, I just want to echo my agreement with what a lot of what's just been discussed, right? Education, I think more around the best practices. I want to actually highlight, I didn't, if I missed it, someone may have already mentioned it, but more transparency into internal processes that are happening within provider organizations around code quality, around product development. I think there's a lot of obfuscation there with respect to those things. I think a lot of times people want to do the right thing. Customers are trying to invest. They're working with their provider of choice. And there's lack of transparency there into what they're actually getting. I understand, companies exist because they want to be profitable, and no one's begrudging them of that. But I do think there is a lot of blurred lines between what someone thinks they purchased and what they actually purchased. And so when you have more transparency into the technology, into the processes, into where you are in a threat development and technology horizon, I think that allows people to make an educated choice, not just a choice based on perceived popularity or things like that.
I think that makes a lot of sense. As we're headed into the last few minutes for the webinar, I kind of want to give everybody a chance to bring together what we've been talking about today. But I think as part of that, what role do organizations like the Cyber Threat Alliance that all of you participate in, what role do organizations like CTA play in helping to manage this systemic risk? And maybe we can use that to sort of wrap up and close things out. So, Matt, maybe I'll start with you on that.
Every organization has its own view of the chaos that is the world today, and it is very valuable, and you can do a lot with that view. But when you put together the views of different companies that specialize in industrial controls, companies that have a greater presence in Europe, companies that specialize in different high-tech systems, you're going to see things by sharing with those companies that you wouldn't see by yourselves. And therefore, you can reduce the risk of your customers by applying the information you learn from them. That is either can be automatic, where we're just throwing IOCs back and forth between each other, and this is bad and this is what it is, and we can auto block and kind of make all those decisions. Or it can be deeper with like an analyst to analyst relationship where you're really kind of struggling with a topic and you're trying to get a sense of what everyone specialist thinks about something. When we had VPN filter, having the ability for Cisco to put in front of a group of some of the best cybersecurity practitioners on the planet, this is our findings and this is what we're going to do about it. Having them push back and poke holes in our theories, and us having to show that we really had all of our work in place and we were ready to move forward with an interdiction, that was immensely valuable to us. And it was immensely valuable to our customers because it made sure that when we were about to take that step, we were ready and we had everything in place.
No, that's great. That's a great example. Dave?
Yeah, I think the role for organizations like CTA and other ones, I think Matt kind of touched on it, but the language I would put around that is speed. When I think about a lot of this, it's the ability to respond with the best insight you can and in a common language. And we help facilitate those connections, the understanding, the ability to move data quickly. And then we have a common way that we like to communicate or have worked out. I don't think we should underestimate the person-to-person relationship. When we have the sectors coordinated, we'll do, multiple sectors together that are working in tandem. it's not about actually solving the problem. It's as important as just knowing who to pick up the phone and call, right? That is immensely powerful and can be extremely fast at helping solution things. So I think it's speed and a common connection and a common language to help facilitate response.
Yeah. No, that's a good point too, because as we've always said, you don't want to be exchanging business cards in the middle of a crisis. Like you need to have that knowledge, ahead of time. Samantha?
Yeah, I want to just continue that train of thought. I think the transparency and just the amount of neutrality that CTA brings, where you're really trying to educate, get awareness, bring people together that have different perspectives so you can learn and you can drive changes in addition to education. I think a lot of times people who've been in a particular industry for a long time, kind of stop educating themselves. And that's life happens. But I think continuing to educate, we're now in a place, and cyber is going to be really changed by this, is not just AI, everybody's talking about that, but quantum computing is going to be a massive shift into everything we know and have known as it relates. So organizations like CTA are going to be at the forefront of helping learn, understand, recommend, as we kind of dive into that. I mean, a lot of us, I don't know if you kind of talked about, or we didn't talk about it, but saw Google's quantum chip named Willow that they announced, right? Where you're taking these, large amounts of data, bringing down the risk of using quantum computing, since historically, right, the qubits are very error prone and people don't really understand them. So you're taking technologies on things that they've designed and built, and then really changing what you can process, what you can understand. And then if you kind of think about your classic, kind of cryptography that we've had today with encryption, with quantum cryptography, you're really comparing now what we've done today with more mathematical in determination to physics, and making it very difficult to compromise. So what does that mean architecturally? What does that mean for the technologies that we buy and consume? So CTA is going to be at the forefront of that. So I encourage people to join in and engage and be a part of it, and contribute. This is not something you want to sit back on.
Oh, no, thanks. Yeah, no, I think that's totally right. And Derek, I'll let you bring us home to wrap it all up.
All right. Yeah, I think I'll keep that train moving, Michael, because I'll go back to that triangle I was talking about. I think CTA really, organizations like CTA and CTA certainly helps to harmonize that, right? So if we think about what was just said on the people level, it's a strength in numbers. My favorite example are the early shares that we talk about of the CTA. I mean, that was, I really think, a key milestone in the industry, where we used the strength in numbers of people's being, pulled together on calls, sharing information before it goes publicly, so we can all be prepared for that. That takes away the element of surprise from the adversary, right? And to me, that's a very strong response on the people level. And there's been countless examples of that. On the technology level, with the CTA, we have Magellan. You have other organizations like MITRE that are driving some of the frameworks like ATT&CK, and you have Sticks and Taxi and all those things that are also incorporated and implemented through that. And that helps with the speed aspect that David was talking about. And then on the process level, right, we have the Public Policy Committee, the CTA. You have, again, ways that we're continually looking at issues and how we can better those issues, right? Is this useful? Is this not useful? How can we continue to strive and improve? That's going to set us up for the future, like Samantha was just talking about as well, too.
That's great.
Derek wins, best answer.
Yeah.
I'll just putting it together, that's all.
Yeah.
You're
Well, thank you.
Just kidding.
Yeah, no. But thank you everyone for joining us, joining me this morning in this great discussion. I think as we've talked about, there's, the cybersecurity industry plays a strong role in helping to manage the systemic risk. And I really like the different ways that all of you brought together different perspectives from your companies, from your experience, your background about how we manage that systemic risk. And I think it is going to continue to only become more and more important as that digital and physical world sort of merge. And what happens in the physical world will have digital implications and vice versa. And it means that we're going to have to get even better at managing our digital risk, because that digital risk will have a lot more physical implications than it used to. So with that, I think we'll bring this webinar to a close. But Matt, Dave, Samantha, Derek, thank you for joining me, and I will look forward to continuing the conversation. So thank you very much.
All the
Thank
best.
you.
Yep.
Have a good day.
Take care.
Yeah.